Hello, my gardening friends. This is a surprise Focal Point Friday episode because I feel like I did you a disservice on Tuesday. So, this week, episode 201, we talked about problems with cucumbers. And one of those sections was talking about the pests that plague our cucumber plants. And wouldn't you know it, I completely failed to mention two of the biggest culprits of killing off our cucumber vines, which are the squash vine borer and the squash bug. Now, the reason that I forgot about these, I think, is because I had cucumbers on the brain and I had cucumber bugs specifically on the brain. So the striped cucumber beetles, the spotted cucumber beetles, the aphids, those types of things. And in my garden, the majority of the pest problems that I have with cucumbers are with those pests, specifically the cucumber beetles. I do have the squash vine borer and I do have the squash bugs, but they seem to relegate themselves specifically to my zucchini plants and then into like my winter squashes and stuff. As a matter of fact, when I was out in the gardens yesterday, I was in my zucchini plants and I was checking every single one of those plants for the squash vine borer and for squash bugs. We'll talk about that here in a second. On almost every single one of my zucchini plants, I found the squash vine borer eggs. On some plants, I found multiple eggs. And there were some random squash bugs sort of in and around that area too. None of my cucumbers had evidence of either of these pests. And those cucumbers are literally one row over from my zucchini and my yellow squashes. I mean, literally 4 or 5 feet away. So in my yard, definitely the preference for these insects is to go for the squashes. But if you're not growing a lot of squash and you are only growing cucumbers, or if you grow a lot of both and you just happen to be in an area where, yes, your cucumbers do get plagued by these guys, I wanted to cover those two for you to make sure that you have as much information at your disposal to be able to sort of keep them at bay. So let's talk about the squash bug first. The big deal with these guys is that they overwinter as adults. And so as soon as it warms up in the spring, they are out and they are looking for something to feed on and then something to reproduce on. So it is very important to remove any debris from the garden at the end of the season to give these guys less places to, or fewer places to overwinter. Now, I say that knowing full well that a lot of us leave leaves and other things over the winter in our beds as a way to mulch for the winter. So, and that kind of counts as debris. So I just tend to make sure that I am cleaning up any squash plants and anything that is in the same family in terms of weeds, because those can be alternate hosts. So you want to bury or you want to compost all your plant residues after harvest in order to give them, fewer chances to be able to overwinter. The most effective approach to messing or to deterring the squash bugs is to manage your plants for these pests every day. Or at least every other day. That's kind of my habit is every other day. So the first thing is I go through my plants and I'm flipping the leaves up. Now I'm doing this on zucchini, but again, this is for cucumbers. You flip those leaves up and you look underneath. Egg clusters of the squash bugs are going to be located where the veins of the leaves form a V. And they are like a cluster of shiny yellow eggs. You will know them when you see them. You can crush these eggs. You can, put a glove on and coat it in petroleum jelly and wipe them away that way. I've seen people do duct tape and pull them off that way. I just crush them. I crush them right there on the leaf surface and maybe even pull that portion of the leaf surface off and crush it really good. Anytime you see any of the adults, you want to pick them off and you want to kill those on site. You can trap the adults by placing a piece of cardboard underneath your plants and you just let that sit overnight. And then you come out in the morning and uncover that cardboard really quick and then just kill all the ones that you find underneath. This is a very violent way of getting rid of these squash bugs, but quite literally it is the only way to take care of them because I don't know of any real beneficials that are targeting squash bugs. I have also done row covers early on to help at least deter them for a while. And if we're talking about the diva cucumbers, like we talked about in Tuesday's episode, that are parthenocarpic, you do not need to uncover them in order for them to reproduce. They do not need pollinators. So if the squash bugs are repetitively every season are in your cucumbers, then you might try growing that diva variety and covering the plants immediately with an insect netting or a row cover and leaving them covered, only uncovering them to work in the plants, to either trellis them or to weed or to harvest. Now, this doesn't always work because obviously there are different types of cucumbers that we want to grow. Not everything that I grow is that diva cucumber. People, our markets like the sort of more traditional type of cucumbers. The divas are a thin-skinned, burpless type. If you want like a Market More 76 or a Straight 8 or one of the more traditional ones, then obviously you need the pollinators. If you're doing pickling cucumbers, you want the pollinators. So if you are using row covers, you can start those early on to at least help deter them for a little while, but then those have to come off once the plants start to bloom. In my plants this year, I am alternating between using that Captain Jack's Dead Bug, the spinosad, and Elm Dirt's Shield product. And I'm using it, like I said, intermittently so that I can extend the amount of time that I can use the spinosad. So far, the plants that I treated have done fabulously well. So I'm sort of doing a control right now, and actually now I'm done with the control because I've seen all I need to see. All the ones that are up by the house were treated in that manner over the course of several weeks, and I have had very, very few squash bugs. I have had no squash vine borer eggs on those plants, and I've only seen a handful of clusters, versus the section in another field that was not being treated in this manner, and that was the ones that had all of the squash vine borer eggs on them. So I'm definitely sort of leaning towards using that combination for the rest of the season. So let's talk about that squash vine borer. This insect is like the bane of many gardeners' existence, especially if you grow cucumbers, any type of squash, even loofah, that sort of thing. The adults of the squash vine borer come out in the late spring, and they lay eggs usually at the base of the plants. And it takes about a week for the larvae to emerge, and then they bore into the stem of the plant, and that's how they feed. So they will feed inside the plant for a few weeks, and then they come out and they burrow into the soil, and that's where they pupate, and they stay there until the next spring, and then they hatch, they become adults, and they start the cycle all over again. This is where crop rotation can come in very, very handy if you have the room, because if you are planting cucumbers in the same space every single season, or in this case, we can talk squash too, it's the same thing. Or you're rotating squash and then cucumbers, they're all in the same family. So if you're planting something in the same family over and over again, and this is the spot where those moths are emerging, well, they've got their target right there when they come out of the soil. So if you see the burrowed area at the base of the plant where the larvae have dug in, you have to cut open the stem and try to remove the larvae by hand and destroy it. This is tedious. It doesn't always work. It all depends on how large the larvae is as to whether or not it has done so much damage to your plant that it's actually going to already die. So the step that you need to take before this is to prevent those eggs from hatching in the first place. Now, a lot of gardeners have sworn by wrapping foil collars around the base of their plants to help prevent the moth from laying the eggs. And yes, that does protect the more tender area at the base of the plant, but from what I have seen, the moth just moves further up the plant. I have, pretty heavy layers of mulch around the base of my plants where it is most tender, and that's not where I'm finding the eggs. I am finding them further up the stem. In fact, I found one right on the stalk of one of the leaves, so it wasn't even close to the stem. So I don't think they're super preferential, and so I'm not sure that covering the base is really going to do too much. Now, I have seen people, and there was one gentleman in particular, who stake their zucchini plants to thicken that stem up a little bit to make it a little bit more difficult for the vine borer to introduce itself into the plant. So if you're trellising your cucumbers effectively, hopefully that would strengthen that stem up a little bit more. But I don't really think that's a very foolproof method either. Honestly, the most foolproof method is almost the same thing as what we do with the squash bugs. You have to be out there checking every couple of days and looking for the eggs. And the eggs are easy to see. You wouldn't think that they are because they are tiny, but they are a tiny red dot, like a rust red color. And once you've seen it, you know exactly what you're looking for, and you can see it every single time. I have gotten to the point where I don't even look anymore. Yes, I'm going through and I'm looking and I'm lifting up the leaves and I'm looking, but I am more just making sure that I am rubbing my fingers all along the outside edge of the stem, all around it, to make sure that I am completely rubbing off any possibility of that egg still being there. So that's your first sort of line of defense, is to prevent that egg from hatching. And then if that does happen and you see the spot where the larvae have dug in, then you have to cut it open and see what you can do. I have also heard of people injecting BT into the base of their plants, Bacillus thuringiensis, and I don't know that I'm a proponent of that. There are genetically engineered crops that are engineered to have BT in the tissue, and I'm not really sure I want to be eating that either. So, do what you need to do to save your cucumber plants. But that's not going to be my first option. I will also say that if, again, you can cover with insect netting until it's time for the plants to be pollinated, that would be a good idea. If you can determine what the life cycle is of the squash vine borer moth in your area, and wait to plant your first cucumbers or squashes until after that cycle is over, then you might have a fighting chance. And this goes with the squash bugs too. If there aren't any squash for them to feed on early in the season when they emerge, and that's the time when they're supposed to be mating. The problem with squash bugs is they mate continuously. So you will quite literally have every single life stage of the squash bug on one plant. It's just disgusting, those stupid things. But if you wait to plant your cucumbers until after the heaviest amount of pressure is over, so instead of rushing to plant right at the very beginning of the spring, or the beginning of May, if you can wait until, I don't know, the end of June, the middle of July, cucumbers produce very, very quickly. And so you are still going to get a ton of cucumbers. And in this instance, you might actually get even more because you're not having to fight the insect pressure. So one final thing, and I didn't mention this on Tuesday's episode, but if you find yourself or your plants, I hope you're not finding yourself succumbing to these diseases. I hope you're not finding your plants either. But if you find that your plants are succumbing to insect pests or to diseases or whatever it is perfectly acceptable and actually recommended for you to do a succession planting of your cucumbers. As a matter of fact, cucumbers are going to eventually sort of start reducing their production anyway as they go into the summer. And so if you planted them very, very early, you might see that production start to wane. And by that point, you might just be done with cucumbers. You might be over the whole thing, and that's perfectly fine. But there's nothing that says that you can't plant a second or even a third crop of cucumbers as the season goes on. So oftentimes what I will do is I will plant cucumber plants, and then the next section that I plan on doing cucumbers, I will go ahead and pop some seeds in the ground at the same time that I'm putting the plants in the ground. So I have one that's already, maturing while the other ones are germinating. And then, about a month later, I will do one more round directly from seed in the soil. At this point, the seeds are popping up, or the seedlings are popping up so fast because the soil is already so warm that they actually catch up fairly quickly. So you can play around with this. But if you start to see that your plants are dying, or, they're having too many bugs or whatever, and you're not able to get much in the way of plants or in the way of harvest, then go ahead and try again. Wait a little while and then go ahead and plant some later on. You might actually be facing a little bit less pest pressure. So I hope that was a good addition to Tuesday's episode. I apologize for missing that. I know there were several of you that asked that question, so I figured I would address it right away and get you the information that you needed. So happy planting and happy Friday.